Okay, so we talked a little bit about the um, different arguments in favor of and against slavery. Talked about sort of the beginning stages of the way that territorial expansion and the addition of new states is going to affect that sectional conflict. And I talked that the Missouri Compromise was supposedly going to solve that problem once and for all. But the problem there is the country keeps adding new territory. And every time there's new territory that's sort of glued on to the United States, there's another time when that question becomes, well, should slavery exist there or not? After the Mexican-American War, the country gets vast amounts of territory in the Southwest. And it's mostly pretty deserted, right? Unfortunately, though, circumstances in 1848 and 1848 mean that the question of what to do with land in the Mexican cession is going to be much more crucial, much sooner than anybody anticipated. And what happens is the California Gold Rush. So in January 1848, a guy discovers gold in a stream near Sacramento, California. And news gets out, despite his best efforts, and people begin to swarm to California, right, trying to make a quick buck. This means that California's population skyrockets very, very quickly, very, very high, and it is very soon ready to apply for statehood. And they decide, you know, we've got enough people, we've got our territorial legislature, everything that we need, we're going to try to become a state. Suddenly, the question of, well, what do we do with all of this new territory, and how do we decide whether states from that territory will be free states or slave states? Suddenly that all becomes very, very important. Crucial, essential. Since it's outside the boundaries of the Missouri Compromise, because the Missouri Compromise went to the edge of the country in 1820, but the edge of the country was the Louisiana Territory, it cannot have any impact on territory that's added to the United States after that. So there's little agreement in politics about how do we deal with California. As if that wasn't bad enough, there's also the problem that right around the same time that California is applying for statehood, there are other things happening. For one, there are 3 other territories that are producing states. So at the time of California's attempt to become a state, there are 15 free and 15 slave. So they've managed in sort of fits and starts to maintain that balance. But at the time of California's attempt to be admitted, New Mexico, Utah, and Oregon are all also ready to join the Union, and they have made it clear that they will join as free states. This means there's the possibility of, within a few months, potentially 4 free states being added to the Union. And this really freaks out what's known as the slave power, right? The southern states, the pro-slavery interest. So that's a significant concern. There's also a growing anti-slavery movement in the capital itself. So the capital is a separate thing, right? It's not a state, it's not exactly a territory, it's this kind of weird, amorphous, limbo kind of entity. It is wedged between 2 slave states, Maryland on the one side, Virginia on the other. And so it is a pro-slavery region, right? There are slave markets and slave auctions that happen right in the center of the nation's capital, all the way up into the 1850s. And so lots of abolitionists use it as a symbolic kind of a thing. They say, how dare a country How dare the capital of a country that is based on liberty and equality and freedom is having slave auctions? And how dare people be allowed to own other people inside the boundaries of the capital of a country that professes to be about that? And so they're making very, very concerted efforts to try to end slavery in Washington, D.C. as well. And so this is part of that kind of, from the Southern perspective, this kind of tidal wave of anti-slavery movement that is happening. The other thing is that Northern states are increasingly passing state laws that are designed to kind of undermine or circumvent federal law regarding fugitive slaves. So, technically speaking, if a person escapes from slavery in a southern state and they travel north, if they are caught, they have to be returned to either the bounty hunter who is pursuing that person or the owner of that slave in whatever state that ownership is registered. The Underground Railroad, this is a good place to kind of point to that. The Underground Railroad is sort of stereotypically, oh, well, you know, the Underground Railroad helps to transport slaves from the South into the North where they would be free. No, the Underground Railroad transported slaves from the South through the North to Canada, because in northern states you were still not safe. There were plenty of times when escaped slaves were returned to southern states. There were plenty of times when free African Americans were quote-unquote recaptured and sent south and put into enslavement, even though they were free individuals. The existence of Underground Railroad stops in places like New York is clear indication that this was an effort designed to try to get escaped people all the way out of the country into Canada, where they would be much more safe. Even so, there were personal liberty laws that were being implemented in northern states that were designed to try to circumvent those fugitive slave laws. And the idea there was that it would limit the ability for those individuals to be returned to southern states. So this is another brick in that wall from the southern perspective, that there are all of these efforts coming at them from all directions to try to undercut their rights as slave owners. And so this is all part of the question, right? It's not just, well, will California come in as a slave state or a free state? There's way more going on here. And so the guy to step up to the plate to try to fix this whole situation is, once again, Henry Clay. So we've talked about Clay a number of times. He is right smack in the middle of that corrupt bargain in 1824. He's a multiple candidate for president. He is actually at the center of the Missouri Compromise in 1820. And he decides, you know, my track record speaks for itself. I'm going to come in and I'm going to find a solution for this particular situation too. The problem, though, is Clay has this idea that any compromise has to satisfy all parties involved. That's bad enough. Clay also has the idea that his compromise should put all of those solutions into one bill. That's what's known as an omnibus bill, where you try to say, once we get passage of this particular piece of legislation, every single question and every single disagreement will be ironed out all in one place. So in Clay's compromise, he says, what we're going to do is this. We will admit California as a free state. We will create federal government jurisdiction in the rest of the territory of the Mexican Cession, but we won't say anything one way or the other about slavery. So here again, it's that idea that we're just going to kick the can. We're going to postpone this until somebody else has to actually, pay that bill. Apologize for the mixed metaphor. He also says, we will abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but we will still allow people to own enslaved people inside the boundaries of the district. In other words, we'll not get rid of slavery entirely in Washington, D.C. Instead, we'll just make it so that people can't engage in, engage in the transaction in buying and selling and trading individuals inside the boundaries of DC. And he also says we'll create a stronger fugitive slave law that will limit the possibility of those personal liberty laws from doing their thing. And he's putting all of this into one bill. Debate goes on and on and on. 6 months it lasts, and no solutions, right? No agreements. The reason being, if you think about it, if I'm voting on this law, I might look at it and I might say, admit California as a free state, love it. Territorial government without any set position on slavery, awesome. Abolish the slave trade in DC, that's fine. You're still allowing slavery, I love it, I'm on board. Stronger fugitive slave law, no way, right? So I can look at that and I can see 3 things that I am 100% okay with. I can see one thing that I don't like, but I have to vote against the whole thing because it's all part of the same bill. And so Clay's idea that, well, we have to address all of the questions, fine, that's not a problem. Having to put them all into one place and make people decide literally an all or nothing decision about this, that's a significant problem. So this debate goes on and on and on and on and on, never any kind of a solution. And then things finally break open in 1850. Clay is running to the end of his rope, right? He is getting older. He's not energetic enough, or he doesn't have enough leverage in Congress anymore to work his old magic. He ends up starting to take a back seat to other people who start to push a compromise through. One of them is the new president, Millard Fillmore. The president, Zachary Taylor, who is really opposed to this compromise plan that Clay has laid out. Taylor dies. Natural causes, nothing suspicious or anything. For the most part, there's still some question about that, but by and large, it's not like he was shot to death in the White House, right? So Millard Fillmore takes over, and Fillmore is more flexible, he's more politically savvy, he's from a different sort of part of the country, and he ends up starting to kind of use his leverage to try to gain some traction for a compromise. One of the other things is Clay kind of steps back, and in his place comes a guy named Stephen Douglas. So if you've heard of the Lincoln-Douglas debates between Abraham Lincoln and some Douglas person, this is the Douglas person that is the other side of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Those are going to happen a few years after this, but Douglas is a hyper-ambitious person in Congress, always on the make to try to figure out a way that he can advance his possibility of running for president. So Douglas steps up and he says, I got this. And one of the first things that he does is he breaks Clay's bill into different pieces, which is really a genius move, because now what he's going to be able to do is he can either get outright support from people that liked one part or another of that bill, or, and this is much more common and something that Douglas does a lot, he's going to link all of these different pieces of legislation to pork barrel, right? In other words, how about if you vote for this, I will make sure that Congress gives you money for building railroads, or how about I give you money for X and Y, right? So he's connecting. It's called log rolling in the parlance of the 1800s. He says, if we both work together, if we both work to find a solution that's mutually beneficial, you can get this stuff, this money, this stuff, this other support from me. I will get this bill passed. Eventually, the Compromise of 1850 goes into effect. It passes in September of 1850. Again, hooray, this is going to solve everything once and for all. But it doesn't. There's still plenty of wiggle room in there where there are significant problems in the way that this bill doesn't technically fix any of those fundamental issues, right? The fundamental issue being the existence of slavery and then the expansion of slavery into new territories. That has never been conclusively and decisively, laid out, right? So there is still no absolute solution because those fundamental questions and those fundamental problems are still kind of rotting the core of America out. And it's going to lead to other problems by the 1854, 55, 57 range, 59. And so you see this from the historical perspective, certainly. We can look back on it and see one domino dropping after the other, leading right to the Civil War. And so we'll get to that process and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Dred Scott decision, those kinds of things in the mid to late 1850s. We'll come into that in our next section. So, again, shoot me emails if you've got those questions, review those longer PowerPoints on Blackboard, and I will see you back here again soon.